Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Thursday, August 7th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. Good to be back with you again today.
Hi, Jessica. Good to be with you as well.
It is day 671 of the war. Israel's cabinet is reportedly weighing an occupation plan that would begin with conquering Gaza City, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu planning to convene the cabinet Thursday evening in order to approve the plans. We will dive into the U.S. administration's reactions to that, including U.S. President Donald Trump's comments on the possible occupation, as well as an update on a new U.S. aid plan for Gaza. We'll also talk about what's happening with U.S.-Palestinian Authority ties, what's happening in the cash-strapped Palestinian Authority, and what are its various limited diplomatic options right now. Stay with us. We'll be back with you in a moment. So, Jacob, let's dive into U.S. administration reactions, or kind of limited reactions, to this possible, probably more than possible, occupation plan of Israel and Gaza City, or Israel and Gaza. Trump's made some comments, but like I said, it just seems like there's not much reaction or statements coming out from the administration.
Yeah, this is not the Biden administration. The Trump administration has kind of removed a lot of the guardrails that might have been in place before January of this year. And when President Trump was asked about this earlier this week, his response was simply, that issue is up to Israel. I spoke with one U.S. official today in Washington who said that President Trump was very impacted by the hostage videos that came out over last week and over the last weekend of Evyatar, David, and Rome Braslavski, seeing their very dire state. And basically the response is now, you got to do what you got to do. And Trump has made these comments before, but basically I think if there is a red line, it's on the notion of, or the question of whether Israel annexes parts of the Gaza Strip. That's been something that I think the U.S. is less comfortable with. But if you recall, that was just a week ago we were talking about that was the new plan that Israel was going to be moving forward in order to try to pressure Hamas. I don't know if this was really something that was just a bluff, that this was just a spin in the media to move on to the real thing, which was this occupation of all of Gaza. But whether or not that was something that Trump was not okay with, or whether Israel simply realized that it was not something that was realistic, given how difficult it would be to reverse legally under Israeli law. So now that the plan is occupation, Trump doesn't seem to have an issue with it. And I think there's really just no pushback or questioning of whether continued war will actually destroy Hamas or coax them into releasing hostages, because this concept of more and more military pressure hasn't panned out well over the past, since March, this new plan of Gideon's chariots that hasn't really, if you listen to Manny on the podcast yesterday, it didn't really pay a lot of dividends. But the Trump administration is not asking those questions or pushing Israel to think twice. It was interesting to speak today to someone, a career diplomat in Israel, who said as much as President Biden and the broader his administration caused Israel a lot of headaches throughout the war, whether it was slow walking some of the aid that Israel felt it needed, or blocking that one package of heavy load bombs, those 2,000-pound bombs last year. But at the same time, the U.S. was very pushy on the issue of aid and wouldn't allow Israel to do what it did, I think, during those from March to May, where it simply didn't allow any aid in. And the Israeli official I spoke with is basically, look, we had our issues with Biden, but it was helpful, if you look in hindsight, it would have been helpful to have someone like him to maybe prevent the decisions that the government did, at least for those 2 months from March to May, that were now really reeling over the massive international backlash. So Trump is not focused on reoccupation, or he's not looking to hold Israel back. And what he said a couple days ago is that simply he's focused on expanding the aid and getting Gazans fed.
Okay, so let's talk about that then. What are we really looking at in terms of this new U.S. aid plan, which obviously has been in the works, in essence, since Steve Witkoff was in the region? I imagine talking about this was all sort of like what the new plan is. What are you hearing about that?
it actually goes back further than Witkoff's trip on last Friday. It goes, I think, till basically July 29th when President Trump was in Scotland and he announced that there was going to be these new food centers that the U.S. would be establishing, Israel would be running, and that new details would come out. Witkoff went to the region in order to move that plan forward, but we're now on Thursday, and there's no announcement of a plan. I think that's because of a couple things. One is that I think they're moving towards, I spoke with an Israeli official and a U.S. official who admitted that the idea is in flux, but it seems like the U.S. is moving back towards the idea of just expanding the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which only has basically 3 sites. It had technically 4, but one of them is no longer operational. So the idea would be to have them not just in 3 locations, which are currently 2 in southern Gaza and 1 in central Gaza, but to have many more of them. Question where that will be will depend on, I guess, if Israel's trying to push Palestinians south away from Gaza City when it's getting prepared, as you mentioned, to occupy that part of it. But the idea was to have many, many more, or maybe around a dozen or more sites to distribute aid, because I think part of the main flaw, one of the many flaws of GHF has been that there's just so few of them. And as much as GHF will tell the media over and over again that it wasn't the plan for aid to just be run by GHF, that was not what Prime Minister Netanyahu and his aides were explaining to reporters in the rollout on, actually, if you go back to May 19th, you'll hear Netanyahu saying the goal is for GHF to phase out the UN because we don't trust the UN. GHF is now saying otherwise, and they say, no, we want to work with the UN or working in parallel. But that was not what the initial plan was. But now we're looking to expand GHF. It seems like the U.S. is leaning to. But in order to do that, they need funding, because this is a kind of an organization that was just put together less than a year old. And it's basically only relying on U.S. funding to date. I spoke with one source involved in the project who said that there are 1 or 2 or maybe more European countries that are giving aid to GHF, funding it, but they don't want to go public because the GHF has just been so unpopular and so opposed by the international aid organizations. Whether or not that's true, they haven't been willing to go public. And the Trump administration has tried to convince various countries. My understanding is that Aryeh Lightstone, one of Witkoff's aides, had held a meeting at the UN last week, trying to convince other countries. It didn't go that well. No countries, I think, are really getting on board. The Gulf states, which was really what the U.S. was hoping for, they see it as a source of real fundraising capacity. They have not been willing to donate to this, to specifically to GHF. They're happy to do the UAE is given, I think, 40% of the aid. So they're happy to continue doing that, but not through GHF, which they just don't trust the model. And as a result, what's been interesting is now we're seeing Israel come forward and admit not only that it was funding GHF, but it plans to fund to the tune of 3 billion shekels, which is around $875 million. And it's not just Israel, it's Bezalel Smotrich, who, if you recall, was talking about not a single grain of aid going into Gaza. I guess he's gone through a total 180 of his thinking on aid. He's calling it's not about aid, it's about winning the war. I think that Israel's back to the understanding that I think it moved away from it from March to May, or even till July, you could argue, that it didn't need to focus on aid and just focused on winning the war. Now it's back on realizing in order to win the war, you need to get as much aid possible to the places that you're not trying to occupy or trying to kind of close off, so you can just focus on the Hamas operatives. But that's the new plan, is that if the U.S. can't get other countries, Israel's going to be the one to fund GHF. It's going to come out of the Israeli taxpayer. I'm not sure how popular that was. I think it's clearly not, because it took until Wednesday for Smotrich to admit this. And for a long time, Israeli officials didn't want to comment on reports that they had been actually funding this. Because if you recall, it was such a sensitive issue that at the beginning of the war, Israel was only willing to allow aid to come in from outside of its borders, meaning from Egypt. It didn't even want to be connected to aid coming in through Kerem Shalom on the Israeli side of the crossing. So we've gone through from that, or from no aid going in at all, to all of a sudden Israel is the one paying for this aid. So it's really quite the total shift on the part of Israel.
Turnaround 360. Yeah. And what's the timing? Just to ask that final question.
That's a good question. I mean, the U.S. was supposed to announce this plan, whether it was going to be just expanding GHF or something new. You would have thought already by now, given the White House last week was saying details will be coming soon. I think they're realizing, due to the funding issue and just to how complex this is, they don't have a lot of aid experts. Steve Witkoff is the one doing this, but he's not he doesn't have a humanitarian background, and I'm not sure how many people he's advising with that do, and maybe that's leading to some of the stalling. I would assume before Israel starts its military operation, this full reoccupation of Gaza, I think you will have either an announcement or a new humanitarian expanded plan in place in order to ensure that even as Israel expands its military exercise or military operations, that those who are not in the line of fire are able to be fed.
All right, let's wait and see what happens. Okay, thanks for that, Jacob. Let's take a quick break. When we're back, let's turn to the Palestinian Authority. What's going on with the PA in the US, visas and funding and budgets, and we'll talk about all of that in just a moment. So, Jacob, you have a couple of stories that we haven't had a chance to talk about more recently. This is sort of a subject that you've looked at for quite a while. You know, the Palestinian Authority, the U.S. is sort of like holding puppet strings over it, possibly denying visas to some officials. Also, there's the issue of the cash flow between the PA and Israel, a very complex financial organization there that bears weight on the PA, which is always strapped for cash. So let's talk about the visas. What are we seeing right now in terms of what is the U.S. trying to enforce upon the PA with this visa issue?
Right. So this came on the heels of, you had several Western countries, I guess started with France, then the UK and Canada, and possibly others, are announcing that they were going to be recognizing a Palestinian state, likely in September. Some of them had conditions. Some of them are just going to do it. But that was something that the U.S. did not agree with. Notably, Trump, I think, was a little bit less willing to criticize countries. He didn't agree with it, but was saying, basically, it's your decision. On Canada, he flip-flopped about whether he was going to condition a trade agreement over their decision to recognize a Palestinian state. For now, that doesn't seem to be the case. But what the U.S. did try to do, and this was coming actually, I think, more from Marco Rubio, because this is the State Department that made this decision, which was to announce several days ago that it was going to be denying visas to Palestinian Authority and PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization. That's basically the umbrella body, the international body, versus the PA, which is more focused just on governing the West Bank, correct. But they're both ruled by Mahmoud Abbas, so there's a lot of fudginess in terms of what the real difference is. But basically, you have these visa denials that are announced. They don't say who, so we don't even know if any actually have been implemented or whether this will be at some point used. But basically, I guess the feeling is that we can't, it's harder to punish these major countries, and it's easier to pick on the little guy, the PA, and we're arguing that the PA is behind a lot of these decisions, that it's encouraging countries to recognize a Palestinian state. Whether that's really why I think Canada, the UK, and France made that decision, I'm not sure. I definitely think they were coordinating with the UPA, but I think there's also, these are decisions independent that I think are larger than just Mahmoud Abbas. But that's neither here nor there. That the decision was made to make this announcement then. And the reason that they gave was not specific to those announcements on recognition. Rather, they said that the PA is in violation of this 2002 legislation that requires the administration to provide biannual reports to Congress on whether the PA, the PLO are fulfilling their obligations under the Oslo Accords and whether they are combating terror. So every 6 months, these reports are carried out, and basically they're just thrown in the trash. The Biden administration was actually the last one to do this report, and it was conducted in January before Trump entered office. And it did find that the PA was in violation of some of its obligations, specifically regarding the concept of internationalizing the conflict, so pursuing cases against Israel in the ICC or the ICJ, or in addition to its payments to security prisoners, this pay-to-slay program that they've been getting a lot of flack for. Now, in February, if you recall, they actually reformed the program and canceled the legislation that had been conditioning payments to prisoners or anyone based off of the amount of time served, meaning the more severe the crime, the more money you'd get. That legislation was canceled by Abbas in a decree in February. And we've been reporting a little bit, Nurit, Yochanan, and I, about how that's actually been started to be implemented. And there's even been a request for the U.S. to come and certify that that reform is actually taking place and that the PA is now in line with legislation in the U.S. called the Taylor Force Act, which bars aid to the PA so long as it's continuing with these payments. So while this report was put together, finding it in violation, that was in January, Biden didn't do anything about it. The Trump administration decided now is a good time for us to actually pull this report out of the trash and say that we're actually announcing that we're going to be punishing the PA as a result of these violations. Punishing is maybe a strong word, though, because of what it decided to do, and that is this visa denials. And what I explain in the piece that we wrote about this is why it's not so significant, because basically the legislation gave the Trump administration 4 options for what it could do if the PA was found to be in violation of this legislation. The first one is cutting aid to the PA, which it already is done. The PA has not been getting direct aid from the U.S. since the Trump administration. It could have 2, close the PLO diplomatic office in Washington, something it also had already done in the first term. Then there was the option, a very severe decision that it could have taken, which was to designate the Palestinian Authority as a foreign terrorist organization. This would have opened it up to lots of sanctions. If you think of Syria, which had it removed, it was a really big deal. So to put that label on would have been a massive decision. And the last one was visa denials. Now, why this is really so insignificant in many ways is because for the PA already, because of the various steps it's been taking, it is required to receive waivers every time a PA official comes to the U.S. So even if you recall, several years ago, Hussein al-Sheikh, who is now the deputy to Mahmoud Abbas, or the vice president, he came to the U.S. He needed to get a waiver from the Biden administration. And the same will be the case moving forward, even though this policy is in place. And actually, what we're going to be seeing in about a month is that they're going to be issuing either a waiver or just simply because basically the U.S. has international obligations to allow any leader of a country to address the United Nations General Assembly every year. And blocking that would be a pretty significant move. I guess you could use these visa denials to say that we're going to block Abbas from coming to the UN. But when the U.S. is already allowing countries that are, I think you could argue, that it doesn't even have ties with, like Iran, to come in, I don't think that would be something likely that the U.S. would do. So for now, they're making this announcement, which I guess you could say is a subtle message that they're not happy with the PA. But I think at the same time, they're not willing to go the much further step of designating them a terrorist organization or cutting ties completely.
And what about the cash flow issue? What about the fact that there's this kind of bizarre relationship between Israel and the PA in terms of budget and financing?
So you led me right into it. So if you think about this legislation from 2002, it's really important for Israel that the legislation doesn't apply, even though it's about the Oslo Accords and whether or not the PA's is fulfilling its obligations to the Oslo Accords. It is not requiring Israel, and there's no punishment of Israel if it doesn't fulfill its obligations, because if it did, then Israel will be in trouble, because we're talking about the money that Israel is supposed to be, a second part of the Oslo Accords expected Israel to be transferring customs revenues, basically, that Israel collects on the PA's behalf every month. Because the PA isn't allowed to do it on its own. It's not a full-blown state. So Israel collects it on its behalf, takes those the taxes on imports, and then transfers it to the PA every month. And this is the vast majority of the PA's budget. And Israel, for a long, long time now, has been taking cuts out of those clearance revenues every month to a tune at this point that's amounted to $2.5 billion. So a massive amount of money that's been accumulating over time. And just since May, because Bezalel Smotrich has refused to give any of the transfer every month, so May, June, and July now, that is $365 million that hasn't been coming in. It was basically a response, I guess, to the decision by the UK to sanction Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. So once again, the PA is the one getting the flack. I think that's been the strategy that Smotrich and sometimes Ben-Gvir are using in their various capacities.
Retaliation, right?
Exactly. So basically, seemingly trying to collapse the PA, despite we had a cabinet decision last year where Israel said the goal is not to collapse the PA. We recognize it plays an important role in the West Bank and maintaining a degree of stability. I think that was also during the Biden administration, different times. The Trump administration, I don't think cares too deeply about the PA. We did see Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador, actually hold a meeting with Hussein Sheikh, which was the first one between those two. Trump has not spoken to Mahmoud Abbas since entering office. They only spoke beforehand. So there's really not a major amount of interest between the countries. Huckabee, after that meeting, said that actually progress was made in getting some sort of agreement between Israel and the PA, where Israel would agree to release some of that money, likely just the funds since May. So 365 million, not all of it, but some. And Huckabee claimed last week that actually that fell apart because of the France decision to recognize a Palestinian state. And Israel was therefore refusing to cooperate or give the PA the money that it is owed. So I think we're seeing a massive stress on the Palestinian Authority. They've held a couple meetings to decide what to do in response, but they're kind of handcuffed. At this point, they've been only paying their employees. Public sector in the PA has been getting only partial amount of their salary for months now, if not a year. Many of them. They're also dealing with this major liquidity crisis, which our colleague Nurit Yochanan wrote very extensively and interestingly about the fact that there's a limit on the amount of cash that they're allowed to deposit, and therefore there's just a massive cash overflow that they're not allowed to use, and it's actually dangerous for Israel because that allows it to be used oftentimes for terror or other nefarious purposes. So against that backdrop, the PA has held several meetings to decide how they're going to respond to this, how they're going to try to pressure Israel, or what they can really do. One option is to end security cooperation, something they threatened and temporarily withheld in the past. And the other is to declare a state of emergency where they limit basically the amount of operations that the PA does and the services to a minimum. But obviously those can both boomerang and lead to complete chaos in the West Bank, collapse the PA. So I think now they're a little bit waiting to see if someone can move Israel. I think there had been hope last week that Witkoff would actually come to the West Bank and give a boost of legitimacy to Ramallah. He had a phone call.
But he didn't get to do that, right?
Correct. He had a phone call with Hussein Sheikh last week, and Sheikh offered for him to come. But Witkoff, I think it was right when they were sanctioning the PA. I don't know if it was a lack of time. He was going to Gaza anyway. But that meeting didn't happen. It's clearly, I think the U.S. is just not very focused on the West Bank. As I mentioned earlier, they haven't even sent that team to certify that the PA is now in compliance with Taylor Force Act, that it's no longer doing these pay-to-slay payments. Despite all the talk in Western, I think, government circles about how important it was for the PA to enact this reform, once it does it, they don't get any credit. They're not even being tested to see if it's actually in place. Actually, Israel and the U.S. continue to use talking points that the PA is still carrying out these payments despite evidence to the contrary. And in the meantime, I think the PA feels like it's teetering on edge. I spoke with an EU diplomat in Ramallah who felt that really this is a very, very dangerous situation that we're in, that we can't simply go on like this. But really, that's been something you've been hearing for many, many months, this concern about the PA collapsing that doesn't really happen. But if you think about, in the case of Gaza, there was the concepcia that was one of the concepcias, the conceptions that were, I think, blown, the misunderstandings of Gaza was that you can just allow it to kind of manage it and fester and it'll be okay. And we're trying to talk about how we've learned lessons from Gaza. I'm not sure if in the case of the West Bank, we are applying those lessons as well and the potential for chaos, I guess you could say, in the West Bank.
Let's hope not. And let's see how this really all plays out, because it's certainly out there for them and for us. Okay. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks for laying it all out for us and explaining it to us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jessica.
And thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode is produced by Ben Wallach. You can always feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care and be well.